Feeling the brush of death, I wished Strohmeyer a good evening and walked into the adjoining room. At the bar sat a good group of our indestructibles. The night was still young, but their spirits were already soaring high. There was Riedel, sporting a moustache that he had kept as a memento of our many shaveless patrols. There were von Stromberg, Burke, and some others. I joined them, drank and sang. We went through a whole repertoire of chantées, some of which we had modelled after Linke's glowworm melodies. Then we bawled the refrain of our version of a popular song, while Burke hammered the tune on the piano. Should we sink to the ocean floor, we still shall walk to the nearest shore. To you, Lily Marleen, to you, Lily Marleen. As so often happened when we ran out of champagne, patience, or ingenuity, we then decided to visit Madame and the girls of the casino bar. Without changing my battle fatigues, I piled into the crowded car, and we drove into the blackened city. The casino bar was noisy, smoky, and gaily illuminated. Several friends of the first flotilla were already there. They roared greetings and jibes at our boisterous arrival. Madame was charming, as always, and her merchandise was still of a certain quality which had long distinguished her place from others. Madame greeted me pleasantly, but with a tinge of reproach. "Monsieur, we have not seen you for much too long. I hope you have not been mistreated by my girls." "No, it was not their fault, it was—" I halted, recalling that her house was possibly an Allied information centre. "It was the tide that had carried me away, madame." She tried to induce me to make my selection, but I had no special plans for that night. I sat at the bar, sipped a drink, listened to the loud phonograph music, watched my friends select their partners. The many girls, the sweet champagne, these stimulated me not at all, yet stimulation was all we wanted in these unhappy days. I realized that the casino bar had lost all its appeal for me. As the clock finished ringing the midnight hour, the air raid sirens began to scream, and my comrades hastened out of the casino bar. They were not intimidated by the bombs. They simply did not want to be trapped in the CB, which would have resulted in less than desirable fame. The sirens were still going strong when a group of us started out through the dark streets of Brest, listening to the heavy flak bellowing in the countryside in the direction of Quessant. Lacking the time to return to the compound, most of my friends took shelter before the bombers arrived over the city. I gazed at the exploding shells in the sky and observed that the main thrust of the Allied assault was directed toward the south of Brest. In the next few minutes, I saw 6 or 7 planes catch fire, fall out of formation and descend in exquisite sweeps, leaving trails of sparks. The greatly improved heavy flak around Brest put on such a spectacular show that I suddenly realized I had forgotten to seek shelter. By then there was no more need for it. The remnants of the air fleet had disappeared. Stirred as we were, nobody thought of going to bed. We joined a group of friends in a tap room for more champagne. But as I settled on a high stool, the door flew open and someone shouted, "The Americans are coming!" We jumped from our stools in disbelief, though after the Allied landings in Sicily and Italy anything was possible. However, the young staff officer who had brought the news hastened to add, "Don't get nervous, men. I only meant that they are bringing in the American flyers we shot down. Most of them are wounded. Don't you want to see them?" The night became more interesting. I rushed over to the nearby naval hospital to see the strangers from overseas. The hospital yard was drenched in daylight by numerous bow lamps. Trucks and ambulances pulled into the parking lot, 2 and 3 at a time. Orderlies, nurses, and onlookers crowded around the vehicles at the entrance. The victims of our flak, some of them badly burned, were delivered on stretchers. Inside the hospital, a doctor I knew permitted me to enter the anteroom. New arrivals were rolled in as soon as some of the Americans were moved out for emergency operations. One of the Yankees, still wearing his leather flight jacket, seemed to be in a better condition than his comrades, but he rolled his eyes and turned his head in agony. As I stepped toward him, I noticed that an ugly but superficial wound ran from his forehead to the neck, neatly dividing his scalp. His haircut was very short, in the Prussian military fashion. Seeing my first enemy at such a close range, I could not resist talking to him and asking him questions. I said in English, "You see, that's what you get for trying to hit our U-boat bases." The American preferred to remain silent. I tried again. "Does it hurt?" He still did not answer. I continued, "Tell me, how did you receive this kind of a wound?" Now he moved his head slightly, as if surprised that an enemy could take an interest in his condition. Then he said, "Well, it happened as I bailed out of my cockpit. My plane was hit, it was burning. The crew had already jumped, but I couldn't get out of the cockpit, the canopy was jammed. I banged my head against it until it broke and flew off. That's how I must have cut myself. How I got to the ground I can't remember." I was intrigued by his broad American accent, for I had been taught English. "So," I remarked, "that finishes the war for you. Aren't you glad about that?" "Well, the war might be over for me, but it will be over for all you Germans pretty soon." "How do you mean that?" "You heard me. We are going to pulverize your bases and your industry, and in a few months— never mind." "Yes," I continued where he had left off, "in a few months we will pay you back. Look, I don't know what they have told you about us and our war potential, but one thing I assure you, one day all your planes will fall from the sky and that's the end of your war." I was thinking about our much-discussed new weapons, including death rays and atom bombs, which were now in the development stage. "Oh, sure," the American said sarcastically. "What happened to your U-boats? Within 6 months we destroyed most of them. It'll all go the same way. You can't last much longer." I was impressed by his knowledge, but also angered by his arrogance. "What you said is nonsense. Who told you that there are no more U-boats?" "Isn't that the truth?" "No, it isn't. I am living proof. I just came back from patrol, and I can assure you there are many more boats still at sea, and soon there will be hundreds available, faster and more powerful ones than those at the front. They will sweep your sailors off the oceans." I was somehow relieved by what I had told him, but the Yankee put on a sceptical smile and said, "Listen good to what I am going to tell you. One day you will remember it, and that day isn't too far away. Whatever you Germans do, it will come too late. Time works for us, only for us." Convinced that he was a typical victim of Allied propaganda, I clapped his shoulder and said, "You will find us Germans not as bad as your newspapers say we are. I wish you a speedy recovery, and one day you will have to concede that I was right." We both smiled at each other, and I left. The Yankees' next stop was the operating table, and thereafter a long rest behind barbed wire fences. When I returned to the compound, it was daylight and too late to go to bed. Instead, I emptied my suitcases, hung my uniform and civilian suit in the closet, and arranged my books on the desk. I selected one of them and tried to read. The effort was not successful, for I heard the American pilot telling me that time worked for them, only for them. I became restless. I turned to the letters I had received from home and read them again. But the voice of the American spoke right out of the lines on the page. The air raids, my parents wrote, had greatly increased, and one of Father's business friends had been killed in an attack. The letters also revealed that Trudy's husband had come home on furlough, and that the two had spent a week in the Black Forest where the nights were still calm and free of raids. These letters reflected the whole truth, the bitter fact that even at home things were deteriorating fast. I heard the American saying that time would work for them, only for them. Early that morning I sailed U-230 into the Bay of Brest to conduct various tests. The flotilla's chief engineer was quick in determining and scheduling the bare minimum of repair work to be performed aboard, for the front demanded a fast turnover of the few boats still afloat. Our old workhorse was to be cleaned, gassed, painted and fixed within 2 weeks, which meant that there was no time to send anyone on leave. For the second time I investigated the availability of the schnorkel, but there was no man on base who could give me an intelligent answer. Instead, I was informed that we were to receive 2 improved radar receivers, which were to detect wavelengths in the lower centimetre range, thus keeping us abreast with the enemy's rapid progress in the war of electronics. In our cruel duel at sea, we had been forced on the defensive to such a degree that the Allies dictated the terms and the weapons. On the first weekend ashore, I turned my back to port and boat and boarded the Brest-Paris Express late Friday evening. During the night, I went into the washroom and slipped into my civilian suit. By previous arrangement, I met Marguerite under the Eiffel Tower. She wore a blue silk dress with embroidered flowers. I embraced her, then met the eyes of German soldiers jealous of this indiscreet Frenchman. Paris was warm and fragrant. The strong scent of turning leaves, the smell of the waters of the Seine, the breeze-blown traces of perfume, all mingled in the limpid air. And above me shone the sun, which I was so often forced to abandon at sea. These were the hours when I imagined that all the bombing and killing was already over, and that I had been spared my inevitable voyage to the bottom of the Atlantic. Shortly after my return to Brest, I was again in blues, and nothing indicated that I had been on a brief journey into another world. The captain was unexpectedly instructed to report to Senior Officer West. We assumed his trip had something to do with our next mission. After a day's absence, Siegmann returned and promptly asked Friedrich, Riedel, and myself to join him in his room. He wasted little time. "Gentlemen, I am going to make it brief. We have been ordered to break through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean." Siegmann paused to observe our reaction. I forced a smile. My partners were grim. It was common knowledge that any attempt to breach the narrows of Gibraltar had only a slim chance to succeed. But what difference did it make where we sailed? It was all the same everywhere. Furious efforts to destroy combined with desperate attempts to avoid being bombed, mutilated, and sunk. It was like committing slow-motion suicide. The end was the same, only the name of the sea would change. However, there was one consolation. If we should be lucky enough to break through the strait, we would be operating in the calm waters of the Mediterranean. To ease the tension, I suggested, "It reminds me of some places I'd like to see. The problem is getting there." The captain took the cue speedily. "If you, gentlemen, keep the mission an absolute secret, there is a good chance of lying on the beaches of Italy in January." The ice was broken and our conversation grew animated. But then Siegmann took the wind out of our sails. He revealed that 2 of our boats, U-732 and U-340, had been intercepted in the strait and sunk by the British early in November. Other boats sent out to break through the blockade had been lost even before they had reached Gibraltar. U-566 had been sunk by aircraft on October 24th near the Spanish coast, and the same fate overtook U-966 on November 10th. Nothing had been heard from U-134 and U-35, which presumably had been sunk without a chance to signal. These recent casualties presented us with a clear picture of what we had to face. As we prepared to sail, the odds against us continued to rise. The losses we sustained during the month of November had jumped again. As of November 25th, fully 15 more boats had been destroyed, which nearly ended the existence of our once great and proud Atlantic fleet. All that we had to stack up against the British-American achievement in November was a mere 67,000 tons of Allied shipping that our torpedoes had wrenched from small convoys. On the evening of November 26th, U-230 slipped out of Brest harbour for the last time. She followed in the wake of an escort, past the submarine net and the Narrows, then continued out to sea at high speed. We knew that our departure had been kept a secret, for the omniscient British broadcasting station Calais, which delighted in transmitting bad news in German, had no special wishes for us when we sailed. It was near midnight when we changed course to due south and followed the French coast along the 200-metre line of the continental shelf. Instead of sailing into Death Valley, we raced south toward the north shore of neutral Spain. Through the night, we were forced to dive 3 times, but managed to see the first rays of daylight without having received serious blows. Shortly after diving for a day-long submergence, Siegmann, speaking over our intercommunication system, informed the crew of our risky mission. Their reaction was a mixture of surprise and cautious acceptance. They had gone through hell long enough to know the rules of the game. There were other predictable reactions. Many a man who had left a sweetheart in Brest suddenly realized that he would not be able to see her again. Disappointment over the forced separation expressed itself in amusing demonstrations. As I entered the bow torpedo room on one of my regular inspection tours, I noticed a seaman sitting on his bunk with his friends crowded around him. He held up a bra and panties, begged, borrowed, or stolen from his girl. His buddies smiled lasciviously and made insinuating remarks. I entered the circle and joined in their laughter. Men with that kind of humour made good sailors. On our cautious voyage to the Spanish shore, we passed badly damaged Lorient during the first long submergence, and in the second night we had La Rochelle on port. When we sighted the lights of San Sebastian, we broke surface, turned westward, and followed the black contours of the high mountains at a distance of 4 miles offshore. Our track along the Spanish coast remained undetected, and we were treated to a view of the glowing cities of Santander and Gijón. On the 5th night we circumnavigated the dangerous cliffs of Cape Ortegal, and 20 hours later we passed Cape Finisterre, the area where 4 of our boats had recently been lost. The following night we saw the shimmer of 1,000,000 lights reflecting in the sky. Lisbon. While its citizens went about their nightly amusement or slumbered peacefully under their quilts, we traversed Lisbon Bay. During the 8th day of our mission, we frequently rose to periscope depth and took bearings on Cape St. Vincent. Shortly before midnight on December 5th, as we approached the Bay of Cadiz on surface, Riedel stepped on the bridge and said nonchalantly, "There is a radiogram on your desk. It's still uncoded. Why don't you decipher it? Must be important." With Riedel's standing relief, I lowered myself into the narrow drum, took up the code books, then sat down to begin my task. But the message was already decoded. I read headquarters congratulations to Werner and Riedel on our promotion to Oberleutnant. We soon had left Cadiz astern and sneaked ever closer toward the concentrated British defence of the strait. 2 hours after midnight, December 6th, we penetrated the Bay of Barbate, the limit of our advance on the European side. We dived and settled U-230 on sandy ground. During the day, frequent depth-charge explosions only a few short miles to the east reminded us that the Tommies were determined to prevent passage through the Narrows. While some of the crew rested and others pretended to do so, I sat with the captain in his corner, plotting the plan of assault. After hours of weighing various approaches, Siegmann finally decided to cut across the triangle toward the North African port of Tangier and proceed from there into the Hangman's Noose. In the evening of December 6th, the men were ordered to action stations and instructed to stay there for the next 3 days. At 2100, U-230 broke through the face of a smooth sea, then hammered with both diesels toward the African coast. Above us spread a dark, clear sky full of brilliant stars. As we emerged from the protective shield of the Spanish shore, radar impulses hit us in rapid successions. Trusting the man at the radar receiver, we continued our dash, with beating hearts. "Detection! Volume 3! The cry cut through the night like breaking glass. We fell into the tower and the boat plunged into the depths in a single motion. After the roar of the emergency procedure had subsided, there was only silence. Encouraged, we surfaced. But after an 8-mile run, a stubborn impulse forced us below again. At 2300, we again surfaced, and when no planes appeared, we drove forward. During our run, we packed our batteries with enough electricity to last for 3 days submerged. We traversed a broad stretch of sea, casting up sparkling fountains which foamed around our hull and left telltale bubbles for miles behind. And yet, incredibly, we remained undetected. We surged ahead until the lights of Tangier became visible, then changed course toward the east and the narrow gap between the two continents. Soon we ran into a fleet of African fishing boats and snaked through the flotilla in daring zigzags. Steadily we steered our boat ever closer to the strait. After 40 minutes we had passed the unsuspecting fishermen and were coming dangerously close to the Narrows, where radar impulses screamed unbearably loud. There was no need for forcing our fantastic luck. We submerged. December 7th. At 00:45, U-230 began her silent run through the depths. The boat was perfectly balanced at 40 metres and floated noiselessly at a slight down angle, but with a rising tendency. Her speed was set at only 1 1/2 knots, just enough to keep her afloat, but the current, estimated to be 3 knots at the point of submergence, would boost our speed over ground to 4 1/2 knots. The current was expected to grow stronger the closer we came to the Narrows, at which point the peak flow into the Mediterranean was supposed to reach 8 knots per hour. I settled myself in the control room to await a day of action. Keistner, our best sound operator, soon detected faint propeller noises and ASDIC pings dead ahead. There were also strange impulses he had never heard before. With Friedrich at the controls, I stole into the radio room to study the new phenomenon. I put another pair of earphones over my head and listened. I clearly distinguished the familiar insolent ASDIC pings from the new sound, which Keistner suggested came from a new detection apparatus. The impulses sounded like the whistling and squealing that rubber toys produce when they are squeezed. Suddenly it struck me. That's not a new British gadget, Keistner. Those are dolphins talking to each other. Listen carefully, you can even distinguish their voices. Fascinated, we listened intently to the conversation of the many tumbling dolphins, enjoying themselves in the underwater current. Some were at a distance, others nudged our hull, but all of them seemed to like the giant steel fish that had come to join their games. Their palaver increased as we floated deeper into the strait, and so did the ASDIC pings. When the first depth charges detonated far off, our squealing companions hastened back into the Atlantic. Above us, a number of British destroyers busily cut the surface in search of intruders. Their activity reached its peak around 1,000. ASDIC pings showered on us like hail, but fast-moving layers of water of different thermal density laid a protective cover over our boat. Unable to make contact, the destroyers resorted to the old game, throwing depth charges at random. By noon, when I assumed my watch in the control room, the pings had lessened somewhat and wandered off astern. It was evident that we had passed the blockade and the narrowest part of the strait. The turbulence decreased gradually, and by 1600 Siegmund's patience had run out. He ordered, "Chief, bring the boat up to periscope depth and let's see how we have made out. Will be interesting to see Europe and Africa in just one sweep. Care for a look, exec?" The captain swung himself into the seat at the scope. He quickly drove around its axis, checking the immediate vicinity. Then he trained it on one spot on port for a while, swiveled to starboard and back to port again. Finally he said, "I think we have the rock already far astern. Let me see the manual." I handed him the heavy volume of the Maritime Handbook of the Spanish coast, which contained a photograph of the Rock of Gibraltar as seen from the sea. "Yes, we have passed it. We've been going considerably faster than anticipated. Call Praga. I want to take some bearings." The navigator soon gave us an accurate fix. The result of Prager's diagram was surprising. We had Gibraltar 7 1/2 miles astern and had penetrated the Mediterranean for that distance. A quick calculation revealed that we had made a submerged speed over ground of 14 knots, of which the current was responsible for 12. Siegmund relinquished his seat, and I aimed the scope at the rock, which rose iridescently from the green water into the azure blue sky. Through the low-lying haze, I counted at least 6 British warships guarding the entrance into the Mediterranean. I trained the scope to starboard and spotted the North African coast rising almost perpendicularly out of the ocean. On top of the high cliffs near Spanish Ceuta, a Civil War memorial projected still higher, and the coast on either side of the monument melted away in the afternoon haze. I was so captivated by the view that I spotted the airplane almost too late to shout, "Dive fast! Dive to 60 metres! Aircraft!" I retracted the long scope shaft, then ducked my head and waited. But U-230 arrived at the designated depth without interference from above. I freed the chief from his duty at the controls and took over his task of recording the detonating charges, which by then was purely academic. The boat was engulfed in wonderful silence. The chances of being detected diminished with every mile. At 2200, the small light bulb over the captain's bunk was turned off for the first time in 12 days, and the dark green curtain surrounding his berth was closed. Almost 24 hours later, at 2130 the following night, U-230 surfaced and had the lights of Malaga dead ahead. As I emerged from the hatch, I saw the dark mountains looming up behind the illuminated city against a pale sky. The night was so mild that I removed my leather jacket. Then the diesels resumed their wild hammering and U-230 followed the Black Mountain Range. We ventilated the boat and proudly transmitted our first radio message to Admiral U-boats. We expected our vital signal to produce enemy action within the hour, but it did not. Shortly before day dawned, we received headquarters' answer. Had been prepared for a brisk encounter with the Allies, who had established a flourishing supply business between the North African ports and the occupied southern Italian coast. To disrupt that traffic and relieve our front in Italy from the Anglo-American pressure was the ultimate objective of our mission. Therefore, I could not understand headquarters' decision to call us into port unless we were earmarked for a special mission which required briefing. It took us 3 nights of fast surface runs and a number of crash dives to escape aerial bombardment before we floated into the Gulf of Lions in the vicinity of Marseille. At 0100 on December 15th, we informed U-boat headquarters south of our imminent arrival. At daybreak we dived, and Siegmund soon spotted our escort through the scope as she crawled over the horizon. 1 hour and 20 minutes later, we surfaced 30 metres off port of the nervously cruising trawler. Her skipper requested us to follow her, and a signal by flags told us to be on maximum alert, for British subs had sunk one of our vessels and one of our U-boats 2 weeks previously. We raced after the zigzagging escort with all hands on deck, wearing their life jackets. At the harbour entrance, a tugboat admitted us, then shut off the entrance by dragging the submerged anti-submarine net from one pierhead to the other. We sailed into full view of Toulon. The bright sun shone on green mountains, on the red and green tile roofs of whitewashed houses, on the rusty superstructures of several damaged and grounded French warships. U-230 carefully manoeuvred through the harbour basin, past 2 sunken French destroyers, past 3 U-boats which lay unprotected alongside a quay. The captain, spotting a small assembly of men in blues, steered his boat toward the empty place at the quay, and U-230 came to rest parallel to land. What was regarded as a suicide mission had turned into a smooth sail. Our incredible luck still held. The representatives of the 29th U-boat flotilla treated us well. Our luggage had arrived from Brest, and even the mail had been rerouted. Nothing was forgotten to make us feel at ease. I was about to clean out my suitcases when I was called to the captain's room. "Have a seat and a cigarette, exec," said Siegmund casually. "I've received a teletype from headquarters which tells me that our association has come to an end. You have been ordered to Neustadt to begin your training as commander. Let me congratulate you." Before I could fully comprehend, Siegmund rose and shook my hand and expressed his regrets that he was losing me. He wished me a better future at sea aboard one of the modern U-boats than he would have with his old U-230. Still surprised, I muttered thanks for my 20 months of service under him, and wished him luck and a new boat too. Then we briefly discussed the immediate problems arising from the changed situation. The greater portion of the boat's company was due for an extended leave, including Friedrich and Riedel. Since my training was not to begin until January 10, 1944, I was more than willing to take care of boat and crew as a last service, and also to spend 2 weeks in a port which invited exploration. I returned to my room a different man. I thanked the fellow upstairs for having allowed me to survive to this point. I pondered my double promotion and what it would mean, and vowed that as a commander I would do all I could to help achieve victory. On December 18th, 2 days after the end of our patrol, the crew was presented to the commanding admiral, who showered us with praise and medals. As he fastened another iron cross to my chest, it reminded me of all my friends in their iron coffins. By that sunny day in December of 1943, nearly all of the old guard of the Atlantic Front had been eliminated, and many newcomers from the German ports were being hacked to bits in the Norwegian Sea before they could achieve their operational goals. The Mediterranean, too, was a deadly battleground. The latest boat to fall victim was U-593 under the command of Kelbling, the one-time guest commander aboard C-557. His successful career was terminated just after he had torpedoed a British escort near the North African coast. American destroyers caught up with his boat and sent her down to the bottom. What our U-boats had not achieved in 4 years, supremacy on the seas, the Allies had attained in a matter of 7 months. Their all-out drive to sweep the seas clean of U-boats was almost an accomplished fact. Only a small force of U-boats was afloat after the bloody massacres in summer and fall. As of that December, the Allies had destroyed 386 of our boats, of which 237 had been sunk in 1943 alone. Siegmann and most of the crew departed that day after the medals had been distributed. I became acquainted with the officers in the compound, who shared the same way of life and the same doubtful future. My new friends introduced me to the city and to their hectic activities in this exotic port. We celebrated all the parties as they came. They came in rapid succession and were welcomed with desperate abandon. One evening I attended an exhausting fete at which boys and girls bathed in a huge punch bowl of wine and champagne. At another wild affair, a spectacular scene was created by a young Italian girl who, rejected by her navy lover, threw herself nude into the arms of an army lieutenant. Just when the mild climate of the Côte d'Azur had convinced me that spring was coming, Christmas arrived. The meagre imported evergreens, garnished with lametta and angel's hair, contrasted oddly with the palm trees and made the holiday seem unreal. During the week after Christmas, a bus provided by the flotilla took us few northerners on a tour of the southern French shore. An abundance of semi-tropical flowers, as well as tall cypresses and luxuriant pines, graced our sightseeing route between the resort towns of Lavardon, Saint-Tropez and Saint-Maxime. New Year's Eve was highlighted by a theatrical presentation and wild celebrations in the flotilla's mess halls. I danced through the night with the young girls from the ballet, and forgot that the oceans were reverberating from 1,000 depth charges and our cities crumbling under the Allied bombings. My days in Toulon ended when Riedel returned from his short leave. He had not had much luck with his travelling. In the wake of great disruptive Allied air raids, he had been unable to make it all the way home to Bohemia, and had spent most of his furlough on trains and in Munich. I turned my business over to my friend, who now succeeded me as exec aboard U-230. For a last farewell, I reminded him, "Keep your eyes open and your ears stiff, old fox." It was indeed my last farewell to Riedel. 1 year later, he was lost on his first and only mission as captain of U-242 in the final battle around England. My journey to Commander's School in Neustadt began in the evening of January 5, 1944. I was chauffeured from Toulon to Marseille by one of my new friends who drove at suicidal speeds over the winding cliffside road. I checked into a small hotel on the Canebière at midnight, slept till noon, then rushed out in my civilian suit to sample the most notorious city of the continent. Sailors, beggars, former French soldiers still wearing their old uniforms, thieves, prostitutes, Arabs, Chinese, blacks and whites, all milled about in furtive harmony. I walked through the crooked alleyways of the old section, along the smelly piers, past the fishing boats and old rotting vessels of yesteryear. I boarded a small motorboat which sailed across the bay to the ancient Château d'Elf, known best as the prison of the fictitious Count of Monte Cristo. That night I strolled through the elegant quarter and surrendered to a quiet evening in a cosy restaurant where I was served an excellent dinner in old-fashioned splendour. At 800 on January 6th, I climbed the wide staircase to the station St. Charles and boarded a train to Strasbourg. While I was carried peacefully through the summery hills and valleys of southern France, in Russia, Soviet divisions pounded the German lines as an overture to their winter offensive. In Italy at Monte Cassino, the Americans bombarded our front in an attempt to break through to Rome, and on the British Isles, the engines of 1,000 bombers were being readied for the night's assault of the continent. My express arrived in Strasbourg at 22:30 and crossed the Rhine at Kehl around midnight. In Mannheim we halted and stayed halted. To investigate the cause of the delay, I went out into the raw cold of the platform. A shadowy railroad employee told me that Frankfurt was under heavy air attack. "They say it's the worst. It looks as though we have to stay here for some time." I had a sudden urge to run ahead of the train. Wild thoughts of what was happening to my parents and home raced through my mind. Only after a long delay did the express creep out of Mannheim and through its extensive freight yard. Then it crawled with exasperating slowness toward burning Frankfurt. A grey, misty, cold morning had replaced the agonizing night before the train edged cautiously into Frankfurt's damaged main station. I grabbed my suitcases and ran through the stench of fire and cordite, through clouds of dust and heaps of broken glass to the street. The large plaza in front of the station was a shambles. The gracious rotunda of stately buildings was reduced to smouldering ruins. An enormous smear of dark fumes lingered over the city. Fire engines, military trucks, anti-aircraft brigades, ambulances, and people by the thousands crowded the streets in a massive effort to fight the flames and clean the thoroughfares of debris. Stumbling over rubble and skirting bomb craters, I hurried across the plaza, turned into Mainzer Landstrasse, made a left turn into Savignystrasse, circumnavigated a huge bomb crater in the midst of the street, noticed thousands of aluminum foils which the raiders had dropped to make our radars ineffective, and rushed on for another 50 metres. Then I made a discovery that relieved my fears. Our house was still standing. I opened the heavy iron gate, walked to the entry, and rang the bell. There was no answer. Assuming the bell was out of order, I went to the rear to call. There, where a garden had been, lay a great pile of bricks, mortar, iron railing, window frames, glass, radiators, and pipes. The entire rear wall of the house had been sheared off by a bomb, exposing all 5 stories. 4 of the 5 floors had already been evacuated. The exception was the second floor, our apartment. I recognized my parents' bedroom, the furniture still standing, the beds unused, neatly arranged but loaded with dust. There was the sewing room with the machine facing an imaginary wall. There was my sister's room with the turquoise decor. In one corner of the apartment hung a bathtub halfway in the air. There was no sign of my parents or my sister. A woman appeared on the first floor and called, "It's good you arrived. We wondered whether anybody would come and take care of the furniture. It might as well be you." Recognizing the woman as the landlord's wife, I said, "Can you open the apartment? I don't have keys." "Can be arranged. Till also get some neighbours to help you to clean up." I assumed from her nonchalance that my parents were off on a routine visit. After the landlady gave me the key, I let myself in and surveyed the damages. The doors to the rear rooms were split and out of plumb. All pictures had fallen off the walls. The floor was strewn with the items blown off tables and dressers. Relatively little had been destroyed, only glassware and some porcelain vases, but a thick layer of dust covered the furniture, beds and floors. In order to tackle the clean-up task, I changed into some old clothes I found in my room, then answered a knock on the front door. Expecting several husky male helpers, I was surprised by the sight of 4 middle-aged women, all of them dressed in light grey fatigues like professional movers. They walked in as if our apartment were their own, and together we pushed the furniture around and cleaned and moved it into the vestibule and front rooms. It was late in the afternoon when the women rushed off, without accepting my thanks. After changing back into blues, I went to the Army's information centre, received food tickets, sent one telegram to my new command explaining my delay and several others in different directions to tell my parents, wherever they were, to return. Then I searched for a place to eat. 4 restaurants of pre-war splendour proved to be bombed-out ruins. In the 5th, a well-known spot on Kaiserstrasse, the fine linen had been replaced with paper placemats and the elegant waiters with morose matrons. The distasteful dinner came as a rude shock after the fine food I had been served in Marseille. It was an obvious irony that Frenchmen, having lost the war, ate like kings while we, the victors, lived on potatoes and ersatz. As night covered the tragic city and its people trembled anew in fear of attack, I returned to our battered home and listened to the air raid warnings on the radio until the danger of another assault had diminished. I awakened bathed in sunlight and gazed about at my strange yet familiar surroundings. On the wall opposite my bed hung a drawing of a nude woman I had made when I was 18. Mother always wondered who had been modelling for me at that early age. Nearby hung a reproduction of Rembrandt's Man with a Helmet, and next to it the gypsum mask of the Inconnue de la Seine, the unknown beauty who had been found floating in the river in Paris, face down. On the wall opposite the windows I had fastened my navy trophies, the emblems, flags and ribbons of my commands, and on the shelves along the walls were the books I had purchased in stores scattered through half of Europe. This was my room, much as I had abandoned it in 39 for a war which, I had been told, would be won in a matter of months. Nevertheless, 4 years of constant struggle had propelled me to the heights in my chosen profession. I suppressed the feeling of pessimism that had been nagging me more and more of late. Soon, we would bring this ugly war to a victorious conclusion. It was dark when a key turned in our front door. My parents had returned. Mother and Trudy were bewildered, but Father said with a sigh, "Well, we have to get used to some missing floor space. It could have hit worse. We are together again, and let us drink to that." Father opened 2 bottles of Moselle wine. We toasted my double promotion, their narrow escape, and our belief that the Allies had to hit much harder to throw us off balance. We stayed together in the study till 3 o'clock in the morning, talking and listening to the radio warnings of enemy aircraft infiltrations. Then, since no Allied bombers were heading toward Frankfurt, we risked going to bed. Late the following night, I stepped off the lazy train in the Baltic seaport of Neustadt, where an advanced U-boat training centre had been established. I found a vacant bunk in one of the clean wooden barracks and flung myself onto a mattress filled with straw. At 0800 the next morning, I found a small group of prospective commanders already practising on a simulator. This complex mechanism, which resembled the interior of a conning tower, was mounted over a large pool and could be moved in every direction over scale models of freighters, tankers and destroyers. The simulator allowed the student commander to familiarise himself with the techniques and tricks of submerged attacks until his choice of tactics became routine. Having had sufficient experience on the front, I managed with ease. After 2 weeks of intensive practice and a boring life in the compound near the small town, I welcomed my transfer to Danzig for active shooting. One day in late January, I boarded the train to Danzig. The station platform teemed with thousands of infantrymen of every rank, and they all stormed the express in a last-minute effort to find a seat for their long journey to the Russian front. I accommodated myself in a smoky compartment with several army officers. They were puffing cigarettes of Russian machorka, a tobacco they had learned to smoke for the lack of anything better. Soon I offered them my aromatic Turkish cigarettes, still available to us Navy men. This gift considerably improved relations between the infantry and the U-boat force, and also the air in the compartment. While the express scurried east, we talked about the war in general, and the Russian campaigns in particular. These men from the front were unanimous in their conviction that their lines would hold against the vast and relentless Soviet onslaught. Said one officer, "The few meters we give them here and there are but tactical adjustments." "The Soviets don't have our industrial capacity," stated another old fox from the infantry. "They haven't the material to maintain their attacks or to stop ours." Said a third, "Their clumsy equipment can never stand up to our new weapons. Just wait till summer comes." I also talked to several of the fighting men, and they confirmed the general feeling that by spring our new weapons and new strategy would drastically change the somewhat embarrassing situation on the various fronts. As we neared Danzig, I wished them luck on the Russian steppes. In Danzig, a streetcar brought me to the pier where the large ocean liners of the Hamburg-America line had moored for years. I found the steamer which housed the 23rd U-boat flotilla in dilapidated elegance. My quarters, an antique stateroom finished in plush and velvet. Although it smelled of mothballs and cigars, I felt an immediate affection for the ship. I found the commanding officer, Captain Lewis, in the bar with young officers who made up my group of prospective captains. Lewis, a former commander with over 230,000 tons to his credit, greeted me informally and introduced me to the men. I learned that only 2 of us student commanders had come from the U-boat force, and none of the others had participated in a single war patrol, as was customary in previous years. They had been recruited from destroyers, minesweepers, capital ships, and desk positions to offset our terrible losses. The novices had been given 1 year of training to learn lessons that had taken me 3 years of active U-boat duty to master. They all lacked the essentials that only combat could provide: split-second reaction, the sensing of the enemy's next move, the experience to know when to crash dive, when to stay on surface and shoot, how to handle the boat when depth charges and bombs came raining down, how to meet 1,000 emergencies. These raw newcomers, who would be entrusted with a U-boat in just a few weeks, stood almost no chance of surviving, and neither did their crews. Before dawn the next day, our shooting practice began with the sailing of 7 U-boats and a contingent of surface vessels. Our torpedoes were propelled with compressed air, which left a clear wake for the grading of our performance during daytime, and were equipped with luminous dummy heads, which revealed our hits at night. Our teachers drove us through a long, exhausting schedule of hair-raising manoeuvres that forced us to think and act instantaneously and soundly under emergency conditions. This grueling routine was kept up 6 days a week for 4 weeks, with very little time off for sleep or relaxation. At the end of the ordeal, the participants assembled in the mess hall, dressed in blues and white shirts and black ties, to be informed of their grades in the course. I learned that I had finished with top rating. I wanted only one reward, the command of a new wonder U-boat. 2 evenings later, I received the order that crowned my naval career. We had gathered for our farewell party in the smoky bar of the liner. After the commanding officer ended his speech with commendations and good wishes, he reached for the bundle of teletypes from Admiral U-boats. "Mein Herren, here are the instructions for your future assignments aboard U-boats. I'll start with the only combat command I have to offer tonight. It's for the lucky winner of the top ticket, Oberleutnant Werner." I rose to my feet. His voice suddenly seemed far away, as though coming through a thick wall of fog. I heard Lewis saying, "You'll report to the 1st U-boat flotilla in Brest and assume command of U-415 as of April the 1st. I walked toward him and accepted the order. It was as good as a death sentence, for the life expectancy of a boat on battle duty had been reduced to 4 months or less, and the obsolete U-415 had already outlived too many patrols. This honour, this bright new command, was merely a matter of changing vehicles for an early ride to the bottom. I returned to my table, carrying the teletype and wearing a frozen smile to hide my chagrin. As if to ease my disappointment, U-boat headquarters allowed me a 2-week furlough before I was to assume my new command. March was a good month for my favourite sport of skiing, and I headed for the Alps, expecting much snow and fast slopes. Changing trains in Berlin, I closed my eyes to the vast destruction and continued on a slow express through smouldering cities and untouched country villages. I reached the small Bavarian town of Immenstadt around 1400 on the second day of my journey. I left the train to board a local to Oberstdorf, the well-known ski resort. A second train had just pulled into the small station, and scores of passengers were dismounting when I heard someone calling me. I turned and looked into the face of a girl I once had loved. I put down my suitcase, and she, without hesitation, threw herself into my arms. "What a pleasant surprise, Marika. What are you doing here?" "Just passing through," she said, her eyes glistening with tears of joy. "So am I. Where are you going from here?" "I am on my way home. I've been at my parents' place for some time." I asked myself why she had insisted on this Wiedersehen. She could as well have let me pass, just as she had 8 years ago. Before I found an answer, Marika had already made up her mind for the both of us. "Let's skip the trains. We can't leave now after seeing each other only for seconds." We investigated train schedules and discovered that we had almost 3 hours before we would have to part again. After depositing the suitcases at the luggage counter, we stepped into the snow-covered street. Marika clung to my arm and babbled happy questions and answers. She had beautiful blonde hair, and her fine features had matured well. We found an empty cafe 2 blocks from the station and took a window seat with a stunning view of the snow-covered peaks. 8 years had blurred my memory of our youthful affair. We had met in the public rose garden of a small medieval town on the north shore of Lake Constance, where the roses blossom until December. We had both fallen in love for the first time in our young lives, and had not known what to do with our new discovery. It had been nothing but promises, kisses, and cautious embraces. When I had parted from the lake, we had vowed to treasure our love and to write often, but 8 months later her letters ceased. Our 12 months of separation had been sufficient to turn her from an innocent child into a bride. It was her colourful wedding announcement which had put an end to the role she had played in my dreams. Since then, I had forgotten her almost entirely, until now when she crossed my path again. Marika painfully explained why she had broken off our love so long ago. It was a classic story. Sometime in March of 1938, she had met a young law student who seduced her during the happiest and gayest night of the carnival season. Soon she learned that she was pregnant. The result? A wedding and the birth of a child she had never wanted. Humiliations followed. Matrimonial rapes, she called them, filled the years. With a new life under her heart, it happened that she met me again. This was all that was needed to make her feel sorry for the previous years. She pleaded, "Please don't leave me again. Don't go away now that we have found each other. Let us make the most of it. Have your vacation with me." I objected at first, but it was not hard to give in to her protestations of love and the stirrings of my old feelings for her. I proposed that she follow me to Oberstdorf, where nobody knew us and where we could register as husband and wife. I bought a second ticket and claimed our luggage. Then we boarded the old-fashioned train to Oberstdorf. The clerk in the hotel guided us to a suite. When the door fell into its lock, 8 years and an endless war vanished. Over our meagre wartime breakfast, I broached the subject of skiing. Marika was not only lovable, she was also understanding. I rented a complete ski outfit, and she accompanied me to the small station from which a lift ran to the peak of Nebelhorn, the highest mountain in the area. As the cable car carried me out over the steep slopes and ravines, I lost sight of Marika. At the uppermost terminal, I mounted my skis and climbed to the summit. The day was remarkably clear. Around me spread the breathtaking panorama of the Swiss, Austrian and German Alps. Those mountains conveyed to me the same feeling of immense power that I always experienced while sailing the Atlantic at the height of a hurricane, and I wished to defy them as I did the mountainous waves. I plunged into a headlong descent, down the steepest slopes, past the most dangerous cliffs, until the tree line forced me to reduce speed. Only after hours and several hair-raising descents could I return satisfied to Marika in our hotel suite. The war had not yet touched the town in the mountains. One peaceful day followed another. During the morning hours I regularly rode to the peak of Nebelhorn and worked the slopes until it was time to meet Marika. In the evenings we enjoyed dinner and drinks, dancing or a movie. Apart from my violent exercise, the days and nights passed in perfect peace. Yet here, as everywhere, the war was a grim reality. All one had to do was turn on the radio. Day after day and night after night, broadcasts told us of infiltrations by Allied bomber fleets, warning the citizens of the Reich where attacks had to be expected and where raids were already in progress. The repetitious pounding reports soon cast a pall over the charming village, and as the week progressed and the time came closer for assuming my command, I grew more and more uneasy. The mountains, the snow, the skiing, and Marika too, gradually lost their allure. 3 days before I had planned to depart, the morning news revealed that Frankfurt had again been under severe attack the previous night, its worst since the raids had begun. With all communications into Frankfurt disrupted, I was unable to contact my parents. Now nothing could hold me in the resort. Marika and I left the hotel and the town together, but parted in Immenstadt where we had met. Her train steamed toward the east. I boarded the express west to Lake Constance, Black Forest, Frankfurt. My train climbed over the hills and wound its way through woods and valleys. It reached Lindau, the island in the lake, at dusk, and 1 hour later, in the dark and fog, it pulled in at Überlingen. Here my relatives lived, far away from screaming sirens. Their daily anxieties centred around their small problems. They knew nothing of the war at sea, had probably forgotten that I existed, for the fanfares which had heralded our successes had long since been silenced. As the train stood still with its steaming engine, I saw in the faint light of a feeble lantern one passenger boarding the express. He wore an army uniform. In the second it took him to pass by the window of my darkened compartment, I recognised my uncle. As he stepped into my car, I said in a disguised voice, "There is a seat available at the window, Herr Major." My uncle lighted a match, held it in front of my face and said, "What the devil are you doing in this part of the world?" "I had a few days' leave between 2 assignments," I answered. "I am on my way back to the front via Frankfurt." There was a pause, just long enough to hint of trouble at home. Quickly I asked, "Have you heard from my parents?" "They are alive, but don't return to Frankfurt. They've lost everything there. Your parents have found refuge in the station hotel in Karlsruhe. I talked to your mother just a couple of hours ago." I pressed my lips together and held back a sudden wave of anger. Fortunately, it was too dark for my uncle to see the expression on my face. It must have been contorted with bitterness and sorrow as I thought of all my parents' wasted effort, of all the anguish and death my country suffered. There was silence for a short time. Then my uncle began to talk about his new career as a commandant of a prisoner-of-war camp. He told me tales of a different war, in which insane violence was replaced by insane indolence. Uncle's appointment had come after a long string of bad luck. He had been at odds with the regime ever since January 1933. As a result of his opposition to the party, which he had courageously made the policy of the newspaper he owned, the government had put him out of circulation. He had spent years in exile in the country, supported by his relatives. With the war had come the demand for men. As a previous officer of the Kaiser's army, Uncle had been reinstated in his rank, promoted, and soon put in charge of the POW camp. 1 hour before midnight, we bade farewell in the blackest part of the Black Forest, in a cold station house where a few female volunteers brewed coffee and soup for soldiers on the move. I sipped a hot bouillon until it was time to board the local to the lowlands and the Rhine. Eventually, after an interminable 6-hour ride, the train slowed down in Karlsruhe station. I rushed across the plaza into the hotel, and a clerk showed me to the room. "Who is it?" Father's voice answered my knock. "It's me," was all I could say. Father was pale, and his hair was suddenly quite grey. Mother and Trudy wept at the sight of me. To overcome the shock of grief and reunion, Father suggested that we go downstairs for breakfast. "It talks better that way," he said. At the breakfast table, however, the conversation never really did get underway. Trudy, still disturbed, was very quiet. Mother, more resolute, regained her balance soon. Father told me that they had survived the air raid in the cellar, where they had been trapped for many hours, and that they had left behind a few suitcases that he was determined to salvage. He had already secured a truck for that purpose, and to move their few belongings to his new plant. We departed immediately by train to Darmstadt, met the driver with his truck, and then proceeded on the country road to Frankfurt. We entered the city from the south and passed many shattered, smoking buildings. Firemen were still digging out the dead, and we saw rows of bodies neatly laid out on the sidewalks and covered with blankets. The truck crossed the bridge over the main river, rumbled through the debris, and past the blackened facades of broken buildings. We drove across the station plaza, around a few bomb craters, and into the devastated Savignystrasse. Large heaps of rubble and remnants of walls were all that remained of many stately apartments. The truck came to a halt before a mountain of mortar and steel that once had been our home. The first story of the attached building was still standing, piled high with the junk from the top floors. It was because the floor had held firm that rescue workers were able to dig through the basement, to cut a passage into our building and drag my family and others to safety. Only that thin margin of luck had saved me from becoming an orphan. I followed Father into the cellar of the neighbouring building. His flashlight revealed a hole in the wall just about big enough to crawl through. I had the terrible feeling that the ceiling would come crashing down on us. Father's hollow voice drifted back to me from our cellar. "Come over here. This is where we sat it out." I crawled in and saw in the beams of our flashlights benches and cartons covered by a heavy layer of dust. I said, "I guess you were frightened waiting down here. Believe me, I know how it feels in a coffin like this." It was no picnic, son. It was like Flanders in 1916, when I was buried in an underground bunker. We brought our last belongings to the surface, and the husky driver heaved them onto his truck. Mother was again in tears. She had made the mistake of climbing the hill of debris in search of her belongings, and she had found some broken pieces of her former world. As Father led her away from the ruins, he professed optimism. "We'll get all new furniture, don't you worry. The Tommies and Yankees will pay the bills." Army trucks and ambulances slowed our exit from Frankfurt, now no longer our hometown, now a dying city. A generation of comfort and happiness ended as we escaped the heavy traffic and turned south onto the Autobahn. Less than an hour later, the truck turned off the highway and drove into the small town of Pfungstadt, where Father had established his new plant. We jounced over old cobblestone roads and into the yard of a dairy, which Father had rented for the production of his patented foodstuff. We stored the boxes and suitcases in his new office. Then Father proudly took us on a tour of his new place, which sparkled with white ceramic tiles on walls and floors. My departure for Brest could not be delayed any longer, so we hurried by truck back to Karlsruhe station. It was dusk when we arrived, and my train was on time. Hastily I embraced my parents and sister. I was confident that their ordeal was over, and that they would be safe for the rest of the war. As the train pulled out, I saw them standing on the platform, waving. I watched them for a long time, till the darkness swallowed them. It was April 4th, 1944, when the train deposited me in the ancient, charming, but somewhat dilapidated town of Brest. An old bus took me through town, crossed the drawbridge over the canal, coughed uphill, and continued westward on the familiar approach to the first U-boat flotilla. I noticed a number of barrage balloons floating gently over the harbour in the early morning breeze. They were a new defence measure installed to protect the U-boat bunker from low-level air attacks. Dismounting at the compound, I found the executive offices closed, but a steward led me to the sundeck facing the bay. As I stepped through the French door, blazing sunlight blinded me. The white garden tables were occupied by a dozen men in navy blues. Not knowing the commanding officer by sight, I glanced around at the men's sleeves for the mark of a highest rank. One in the group said, "Are you the new captain of U-415? "Yes, I am."